Hi guys, thanks very much for joining me. Now we're going to move on looking at Thatcher's economic policies. We've looked at monetarism, we've looked at privatisation, and today we're going to start looking at deregulation, what this means, and how does this change the economy during the 1980s. Now before we go any further, I want you to have a look at this quote from Margaret Thatcher. It's a speech she made to the Small Business Bureau Conference in February 1984. So it's at the start of her second term in office. And I want you to press pause and I just want you to read this. Now, having read it, you should get a good idea of Margaret Thatcher's view of small business and what she wants to do. She sees small business as being really important, creating jobs for others rather than waiting for others to create jobs for them. It links back in with this idea of Margaret Thatcher's view of individuals helping themselves, individuals being responsible for themselves, rather than the state taking responsibility for you. Now, before we go any further, what you're going to need to understand are three key terms. I've put them up on the screen in front of you, and again, it's going to be useful for you to pause the screen and copy these down because you need these in your notes. So I'm going to give you a couple of moments to do that. Press pause and then we'll carry on. Now this first term, financial deregulation, this loosening the controls the Bank of England had on banks, and it's cutting the red tape. The idea of red tape is what binds you up. Red tape is what restricts free movement, restricts businesses doing certain things. There are rules, there are regulations, so they're going to be removed or reduced. Then we move on to this idea of investment banking. And this is companies obtaining finance through bankers. Investment bankers will supply funding or obtain investors for companies to allow these companies to grow. And then finally, we've got this term, financial speculation. And it's the idea of people conducting transactions, investment banking, but there's a substantial risk. However, if you make a good financial decision, you could make huge gains. So some people are going to become incredibly wealthy through this, and we need to look at that later on throughout this lesson. So, how does Margaret Thatcher's government encourage new business? And we're going to think back to that quote that I showed you at the start of the lesson. So the first way that Thatcher's government encourages new business is deregulation. This idea of removing red tape, so it makes it easier for businesses to trade and grow. The idea being that this growth will lead to entrepreneurship, more people investing and starting businesses, and wealth creation. But as the businesses grow, they're going to need to employ more people. So the logic is that more and more people become employed due to deregulation. These businesses are going to be employing more people. The next thing that Thatcher does, or her government do, is the Loan Guarantee Scheme, and it's part of the Industrial Development Act of 1982. And within the first 2 years, it's enabled 13,000 small businesses to borrow £440 million. The idea being that banks are going to be supported by the government in loaning money to small businesses. It encourages businesses to grow. It encourages them to take a risk and go to the bank and borrow money. The bank is supported by the government to do this, so they don't take on the same risk as well. And then finally, we've got the Enterprise Allowance Scheme. And this encourages people who've been unemployed or who are unemployed to start their own business. And they get paid £40 a week during that first year. However, they need to have £1,000 of their own money prior to receiving the allowance. So for the first 12 months of their business, they'll be paid £40 a week by the government. Now in today's terms, that's £142 per week, and they would need £3,500 of their own money to start the business up. All of these are ways that Margaret Thatcher's government encourages new business. Now let's have a look at the impact of financial deregulation. And the most important part of this is known as the financial Big Bang. That takes place on the 27th of October 1986. Now up until that point, trading, the selling of stocks and shares, investments, had been done in the stock exchange on what was known as the trading floor. So you would have men, and there would generally be men, who would be selling and buying shares, making investments, using pieces of paper in a busy and sometimes hectic exchange room. Now I've shown you an example of that. You've got a picture seeing how busy that could be. And you get this idea of what's happening. And if you see, the vast majority of people there are men wearing suits. And it was often described as a bit of an old boys club, so to speak. They all knew each other. They'd all been to the same schools. They're all part of the same clubs. However, the Big Bang changes this, and what you see is traders start to use computers. No longer are they on the stock exchange floor, they're now sat behind desks working on computer screens. The other thing we see change is foreign banks are now allowed to operate in London as stockbrokers. This allows London to grow. It can now compete with places such as New York as a financial centre for trading. Prior to the Big Bang, only British banks were allowed to operate as stockbrokers, and this really put them at a disadvantage to places such as New York. However, once the Big Bang took place, foreign banks could now operate as stockbrokers in London. London grew as a financial centre and world city. And finally, this old boys network was replaced. Remember when I talked about that on the stock exchange floor and I showed you the picture of all the men in suits? Well, this was replaced by this new breed of dealers who were sat behind their computer screens. And these dealers become known as Yuppies. They're willing to take large financial risks for greater profits. Now this term Yuppies, it's really important we understand this, and it means a young urban professional. It was often used as a word as almost derogatory, a bit of fun, but it described people who worked in cities and earned a large amount of disposable income as a result of their financial trading. They'd spend it on expensive cars, meals, technology, such as early mobile phones. So you end up with this group of society known as Yuppies, and that's one of the results of the Big Bang. Now what happens to the economy during this period? Well, it's clear to see the economy does grow. We see that happening around about the period of the Big Bang during 1986. You can also see a rise when you look at 1982 when the loan guarantee scheme comes into place. So we can really see some effects that the government policy is having on the economy during this period. However, you need to look at both sides of the argument here. And in reality, the average growth rate during the 1980s was no better than it was in the 1970s. It was 2.2%. And when you measure that across other Western countries or industrialised countries, Britain isn't doing that well. Pretty much mid-table. We're way behind Japan, and we're only ahead of Germany and France. So the economy doesn't do hugely different compared to the 1970s. Now, based on all of this, here are the key things you need to be including in your notes. You need to explain what deregulation is. You need to be able to explain the measures the government puts in place to encourage businesses, and also what's the impact of financial deregulation. Describe what it does to London, and then explain this term Yuppie. And then finally, using those two charts that I've just shown you, describe how far did the economy grow, what happens to the economy. I want to see that work from you, so you need to send that to me on Teams, but it's important you include detail in here. Don't just include 1 or 2 lines for each one, make sure you back each point up with some evidence, because that will be really useful when we start revising and when we're writing essays about this period. As always, if you've got any questions, drop me a line, get in touch. Thanks very much.